Okay, today is October 2nd, 2021. We are continuing our biography series with Gerald Horne. Welcome back, Professor Horne.
Thank you.
There's two details I overlooked from the 80s that I wanted to mention. One is that in 1982, you got a PhD in history from Columbia University. And the other one was that I was looking into more detail. It seems that you got your master's also from Columbia in '78, but I think that your master's was in philosophy.
That's just like, instead of an MA, it's MPHIL, that's all.
Okay.
It's in history. I'm not sure why there's that distinction.
Oh, because I saw PHIL afterwards.
Right.
But that doesn't mean philosophy.
Well, it may, but it was definitely in history. I guarantee you I didn't study philosophy.
Okay, well, moving in time forward to the 1990s. In 1995, after you got back from Zimbabwe, doing your Fulbright in Zimbabwe, what did you do?
So that's when I went to UNC. Let me see if there's anything about Southern Africa I should mention. I can't recall what I said about it, other than that, it was very good to be in Southern Africa. Zimbabwe is a very pleasant place to live. I mean, I've oftentimes pointed out in radio interviews that part of the tragedy of Africa is that Zimbabwe, with all of its present day problems, including sanctions because of land reform that's driven the economy into the ditch, it's still a recipient nation for Africans fleeing from other parts of Africa, because it's because there was a settler regime there. They built up the infrastructure to a certain degree, and though frayed to a certain degree, the infrastructure is still better than the infrastructure in a lot of African countries to the north, like Congo, for example, Burundi, for example, even Zambia, which is its northern neighbor. And then, of course, the weather is very pleasant. I've oftentimes thought about going back to reside there. It's very, very pleasant. But anyway, I go back to UNC Chapel Hill. I was supposed to be helping to develop. There was this controversy there about building a Black cultural center. And so I was recruited to help build it. And, I still have a residence in Chapel Hill. I mean, I'm glad I was in Chapel Hill, because Chapel Hill and Duke have some of the best resources for slavery in the United States. And of course, the campuses are only 7 miles apart. So that's when my interest in slavery was stimulated. And also, this is part of this longer process whereby what had been a sideline, that is to say, writing and studying history, sort of becomes the main event, basically. It overwhelmed everything else, as it has done to this day. So the Black, it's interesting, this Black Cultural Center, because of course it was controversy. The line was, this is how the United States works. So the line was, it's separatism. So where I was living at Chapel Hill, every day I would walk past the Hillel Center, which was a center for Jewish and Jewish American students. So I would always say, was the Hillel Center separatist? And then, of course, even if you raise the question, it means you're a bigot. You're not allowed to interrogate any aspect of the construction of whiteness. You just can't do that. Even though I think somebody coming from outside the United States, that would be one of the first questions they would ask. But of course, you have to normalize the folding in of the Jewish community into this construction of whiteness, which has been, as I said in my 16th century book, is one of the key pillars of settler colonialism, although I didn't know that at the time. So that it's typical U.S. I mean, you can't even raise the question. But Also, when I was in Chapel Hill, I was able to, let's see, I did, I think,
How did the issue resolve regarding the,
oh, it was built.
okay, that's great.
It was built, but not during my tenure,
Oh, wow.
because I'd left to take this chair at Houston. But I don't know if I mentioned, when I was in Chapel Hill, I finished the book on Shirley Graham Du Bois. And
Oh,
as
you-
I say in the introduction to that book, the book started when I bumped into David Du Bois, who was the stepson of W.E.B. Du Bois and the son of Shirley Graham Du Bois. On the streets of Manhattan, he was teaching in UMass Amherst and making enough to live in Cairo.
Hmm.
So he told me that her papers were still in the apartment she used to live in Cairo, because after the Ghanaian coup of 1966, she decamped to Cairo. And so it was 1994, 1990, right before I came to Chapel Hill, I flew there and did research. And that formed the basis for this biography of Shirley Graham Du Bois, Race Woman. And David himself was quite a character. During his life, he had been affiliated with the Black Panther Party. He was an editor of the Black Panther newspaper for a while. In fact,
Wow.
he wrote a novel. Quite a character, I must say. And it was also in Chapel. Let's see, I published that book. Oh yeah, I published my Watts book in 1995, which had been the product of research in Southern California. It was one of my Southern California projects. And, you know, I don't have my list of books before me, but anything that I published before 2003, any books, of course, would have been completed while I was in Chapel Hill, because I was in Chapel Hill from 1995 to 2003. Although one aspect of being at Chapel Hill was I was involved in the organizing of the Black Radical Congress that had its convention in 1998 in Chicago. And it was a worthwhile venture, but it didn't survive because I think it got caught up in sectarian politics. But it was an attempt to try to merge different left-wing tendencies and Black nationalist tendencies under one roof. But it didn't survive. And you would have to jog my memory with regard to anything else between 1995 and 2003.
Yeah, just to provide some context for the audience, from 1995 to 2003, you began teaching at UNC Chapel Hill. You were the professor of history there, communication studies, African/Afro-American studies, and also the director of the Sonia Haynes Stone Black Cultural Center, and the director of the Institute of African American Research. There, how did you end up at Chapel Hill?
Well, as I said, they were desperate because Chapel Hill is a very interesting place. I mean, North Carolina is very interesting. The Chapel Hill campus is a big deal in the state, being the so-called flagship campus. Plus, one of the things I noticed about Chapel Hill, which I think you can even generalize, is that they were very sensitive to how they're perceived outside of Chapel Hill, particularly in the New York Times and Washington Post. And so the controversy of this Black Cultural Center was getting a lot of play. You know, the burghers of Chapel Hill in North Carolina, they don't want to be perceived as racist. For whatever reason. And so that made this Black Cultural Center a hot topic, a hot potato. And so they were recruiting. A lot of people wouldn't want to take that sort of position because it's controversial, but I think I was ready to leave Santa Barbara, ready to leave Southern California. I mean, I like Santa Barbara, but you know, it was 90 plus miles from Los Angeles, and you know that even though driving 90 plus miles on a regular basis in Southern California is no big deal, anywhere else it's a big deal.
Mhm.
And so all of that commuting and driving, I was ready for a new experience. And of course, it came with a salary increase as well.
And how did you like living in North Carolina? It's probably your first experience living in the quote unquote South instead of the Midwest.
Yeah. I mean, it was okay. Let's see. I liked the fact, as I said, I liked the library resources. That's, you know, Duke, UNC, very good library resources. Very good archival resources. Like my Kenya book, some of the research for that was really done in Chapel Hill, for example. I still go back to Chapel Hill to do research because the archival resources are so tremendous. And it was fine. I mean, it was okay, you know.
Do you want me to read a list of books that you wrote during that time frame?
Yeah, before 2003.
Right. So just for the period of time that you were in Chapel Hill, it looks like Race for the Planet, the U.S. and the New World Order.
Yeah, that's sort of a. I mean, that's an attempt to understand what was going on in the world.
Mm-hmm.
I've done a number of books where I'm trying to understand what's going on in the world, because part of my approach is that you really can't understand what's going on in the United States unless you understand what's going on in the world. And so that's part of that project. My book, Blows Against the Empire, comes out 2008, as I recall, mm-hmm. U.S. Imperialism and Crisis. It's an attempt to understand what's going on in the world in light of the 2007-2008 collapse on Wall Street, Lehman Brothers and all the rest. Because I perceive that as a turning point, which I think it was. And I'm thinking about doing another one, particularly if I remain in this pandemic lockdown, because those books are not that hard to do. You just basically, you know, I read newspapers every day still. Maybe I should mention that, you know, nowadays, since I'm in lockdown, so I get delivered to where I'm staying in Houston, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Financial Times, and Houston Chronicle. And then I get in the mail, the Washington Post and the LA Times. So that's, you know, 7 daily newspapers. Then I get China Daily, which is a daily. The Economist, which poses as a British publication, but it's really a right-wing US publication. But it does cover the world. It covers a good deal of the world that the New York Times, believe it or not, misses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's comprehensive.
Yes, it is. You know, the political line is very shaky, though, I must say.
Yeah, it's terrible politics.
Oh my God. They like to take these right-wing US positions, like attacking cancel culture and all this other nonsense. You know, that's typical economists. Business Week, now Bloomberg's Business Week, you know, the New Yorker, the Nation, the Washington Examiner, which is another right-wing publication. The Amsterdam News, Final Call, Los Angeles Sentinel, which are Black publications.
And you get all these in print?
Yeah, it's old school. I don't think I have any online subscriptions, believe it or not. Mm-hmm. Although I read a lot of stuff online, like in the mornings. I should mention this. So every morning, this only takes about a half hour, so it's just reading headlines. Drudge Report, which is very useful, I must say. Huffington Post, Politico, Real Clear Politics, Real Clear World, Mail and Guardian of South Africa, Herald of Zimbabwe, allafrica.com, asiatimes.com, The Guardian of London, then crossing the Atlantic to the New York Post, San Francisco Chronicle, East Bay Times, which is Oakland, LA Times, even though I get it in print, Boston Globe, Raleigh News and Observer, Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Miami Herald, New Orleans Times-Picayune, Houston Chronicle, even though I get it in print, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Chicago Tribune, and then the Washington Post and New York Times, which of course I get in print, but I look at the headlines anyway because there's always breaking news. And that only takes about a half hour in the morning because I'm just looking at headlines, zipping through them.
Mm-hmm. How
And
about
then occasionally reading an article.
how about Grandma from Cuba?
Oh yeah, Grandma. Except Grandma has been, Cuba's had a lot of problems lately, so they haven't been sending me my grandma. Although I do, and then I subscribe to these listservs like this friend of mine in Los Angeles, Walter Lippmann, who sends out a Cuba newsletter, and then Johnson's Russian list, which comes on email. And I must say, whenever that comes in through email, it's usually about 11 a.m. Central. I usually look at it, and it's usually like 20 to 30 articles. And I usually only read one or two.
Mm-hmm. What about Orinoco Tribune?
Yeah, I only get that through Walter Lippmann's Cuba News,
mm-hmm.
Which I highly recommend his Cuba News. What else do I read? I'm probably forgetting something, but it's probably telling that this is what I remember in any case.
And I think I heard you say somewhere on a different interview that you get up at 4 a.m. to start reading the news.
Because my regime now is so I was jogging there's a swimming pool in this complex where I live, where I'm under lockdown. Before lockdown, I was traveling all the time, but now I'm stuck. And so there's a swimming pool, so I would jog in the swimming pool. Now I jog on a treadmill. That's my exercise. And but I only do that in the evening, right before I go to bed. Mm-hmm. I usually go to bed at 9 p.m. And I have a very heavy media diet. Al Jazeera, of all of these media outlets that I'm about to mention, it's definitely more comprehensive. It pays a lot of attention to Africa, unlike, well, actually France 24, since France is a neo-colonialist in Africa, pays attention to Africa. Russia, RT, is getting a little shaky, I must say, even though I appear on RT all the time, and some of the stuff they've been doing lately is questionable at best.
A lot of anti-vaccine stuff.
Oh, RT is, some of the stuff they do is, as a matter of fact, apparently BET is putting out a movie called Karen, the whole Karen phenomenon. Mm-hmm. So RT had an article attacking BET as anti-white. Come on, RT, come on, man. And what? Oh yeah, Press TV. I was just on Press TV. That's the Iranian. PressTV.ir. Although I still have a bone to pick with Press TV because I'll never forget during the Libya crisis of 10 years ago, they were basically cheerleading. I think they had a problem with Gaddafi, and then which to me is like very subjective. I mean, whatever your problem with Gaddafi, you should realize that overthrowing his regime would not be good for Iran. Please. So listen. Also, the Africa, Voice of America, Africa News Tonight. I listened to that. The Africa stuff, BBC Focus on Africa, and Deutsche Welle, Africa Link. Although I've sort of dropped that because Germany, I don't know. I mean, they're not as good as Voice of America. The thing about Voice of America, you can get a gleaning of U.S. foreign policy from Voice of America. Because Voice of America, they attack the South African government all the time. I mean, you would think that regime was about to collapse, which makes me very suspicious, I must say. In any case, BBC Focus on Africa is informative. Of course, C-SPAN.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes tune into hearings. Of course, NPR, Pacifica.
Mm-hmm. How about podcasts and stuff? Do you
Well, podcasts.
like Sputnik Radio?
Oh yeah, I do Sputnik. Oh gosh, how could I forget the board? They'll get mad if they see this because I'm on there at least twice a week. But I only do podcasts if somebody sends me something, basically. I mean, it's not like something I tune into. But if someone sends me something and say, you should listen to this, I usually do.
How about Black Agenda Report?
Oh yeah. Because I was good friends with Glenn Ford. I was very surprised to get an obituary in the New York Times. Yeah, very surprised, very pleased, in fact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they have a fair amount of content. I mean, the radio show is over, or at least paused for the moment. But how about Black Power Media?
Only when I'm on. I have this friend, Sharice Burden-Stelly, who I've written books with.
Dr. CBS.
Yes. So when
she's amazing.
Yeah, right. So she's had a relationship with them. Mm-hmm. So when she sends me something, I usually tune in, but I can't say I tune in on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm. I guess going back to your list of books from the North Carolina years, I think the next one is The Fire This Time, which you mentioned, the Watts Uprising in the 1960s. The next one on the list is Testaments of Courage. Selections.
I used to do books with my older sister, who's now no longer with us. She was a professor at Berea College in Kentucky and at the College of Worcester in Ohio. She was a very important influence on me. She was a language specialist, particularly Spanish and Romance languages, although she picked up some Korean as well. But about 20 years ago, she passed away.
For the sake of the audience, that's Mary you're referring to.
Yeah.
I think the other book you did with her was W.E.B. Du Bois, an encyclopedia.
Yeah, we did that book. Did the book on slave narratives. I think that was it, though. I think we only did 2 books together.
Yeah, I think so as well. The next book on the list is Powell v. Alabama.
Yeah, that's a young adult book on the Scottsboro case.
Scottsboro Boys and American Justice is the title.
Yeah. I enjoyed doing that.
The next book, which you mentioned already, was Race Woman, The Lives of Shirley Graham Du Bois.
That's right.
The next one, which I wanted to ask you about, it's on my list of books to ask you about, is Class Struggle in Hollywood. 1930 to 1950s, moguls, mobsters, stars, Reds, and trade unionists. Why did you write that?
So that's part of living in Southern California. And that's the advice I oftentimes give people. You should. It's easy to do research in the area where you're staying. Basically, I was in Los Angeles all the time. If you look at the footnotes, a lot of the footnotes are from the film industry in the United States is based in Los Angeles. And interestingly enough, part of that book, a good deal of that book, deals with the strike at Warner Brothers in 1945 by the so-called below-the-line workers, camera operators, set designers, makeup people, hairstylists, etc. And just yesterday, October 1st, that same union took a strike vote. This may be the first strike in 70 plus years. And it may be jumping off soon. We'll see. And doing that book, of course, it helped to, doing that book and the Zimbabwe book, it helped to stimulate my interest in organized crime, which I've traced in a number of different books since then. And I did this article, which has been circulated quite a bit. I did it in Zimbabwe, although some of it's based on that Hollywood book called Rethinking the Lumpen. Because as you know, the Black Panther Party, part of their, quote, contribution, unquote, was sort of turning the lumpen into heroes, basically. As a matter of fact, on my radio show at KPFK in Los Angeles, oh yeah, we were interviewing an author who did a book on the Black Panther Party. And so we played, the party had this singing group called the Lumpen.
Mm-hmm.
So we played the Lumpen in the background while she was being interviewed. I think I have to confess, I think that was a theoretical mistake, but that's another story for another day.
And you kind of alluded to this, but in the jazz book, which is here.
Yeah, there's a lot of organized crime stuff in there.
Yeah, and the boxing book.
Yeah, a lot. Oh, definitely. That's been a repetitive, because I mean, if you look at the history, assuming we're not overcome by climate change and nuclear war, I think that future historians will see organized crime as a major theme of settler colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what I'm driving at. Because if you think about it, I mean, how do you roust indigenous people from the land? Mm-hmm. I mean, it takes means mostly foul. It takes cutthroats. It's just like when you write, like I'm doing this history on Texas. I mean, everybody's always talking about as Texas, as these so-called Anglos, as they were then called, and still are to a degree, were moving into Texas post 1821. Everybody is always talking about, well, not everybody, many people are always talking about the cutthroats. Because and that's part of the whole class collaboration aspect, because even though there's a 1% that are the puppeteers, it's just like I was just watching a documentary on World War II that featured the late economist John Kenneth Galbraith. Mm. So it was an advisor to John F. Kennedy. And so he was talking about during World War II, how he had to analyze the success or lack thereof of US bombing campaigns from the air. And he was saying, well, the conclusion we came to is that you really needed boots on the ground. I mean, you know, it was helpful, but you really needed boots on the ground to oust the Nazis. Hmm. And I think the subsequent history generally has proven that to be the case, although some might point to the bombing campaign in the 1990s against Yugoslavia as an exception. I'll defer if someone takes that point of view. But certainly with regard to Texas and settler colonialism, you needed boots on the ground. You needed people to face off against the indigenous population face to face. And it's not for the faint of heart. You know, you need cutthroats, basically.
Mm-hmm. I heard someone argue recently that even before cotton, there was tobacco.
Yes.
And so the U.S. has always kind of had this narco trafficking.
Don't forget sugar.
Mm-hmm. Someone was making this parallel argument about, you know, U.S. and Afghanistan and their connection to opium.
Oh,
and
sure.
And that even from the founding of the U.S., or the so-called founding, the taking of the, you know, the stolen land, that with the advent of tobacco, which is a drug, there's always been this kind of narco trafficking history within the U.S.
Yes, and let's not even forget, since you mentioned the verb trafficking, human trafficking, mm-hmm. which is, I interviewed on my radio show the guy from Michigan, John Wells, who did this book, The Kidnapping Club, mm-hmm. about
last week.
Yeah, kidnapping of free Negroes in New York. I mean, it's just human trafficking, basically. Mm-hmm. You know, 12 Years a Slave, the Solomon Northup story, turned into a movie, mm-hmm. Which we talked about in that particular interview. And of course, I mentioned on the radio just yesterday, and this is based on a story in the New York Times from yesterday, that according to the New York Times, October 1st, 2021, in 2020, 70,000 Black girls below the age of 18 are missing. 70,000. Of Black children are 14% of the child population in the United States, but 31% of missing children. Now, even if you factor in that, okay, some of these people, they may return home, let's say 35,000, that's still a lot. I mean, what's happening to all these people? And why doesn't it get more coverage? Anyway, that's a...
And the same could be said for what we refer to as the family policing system, which Euro-Americans refer to as the child welfare system, where there's 500,000 children taken from their parents. In New York City, for instance, 94% of the children removed from their families are non-white. So there's clearly, racist element in the what we call the family policing system. So there's a common thread throughout the history of this country that's still very strong today. When you going back to kind of this mafioso theme, you mentioned that it was evident in your Zimbabwe book as well.
Yeah, because of mercenaries, because these mercenaries were no more than cutthroats. There's a lot of mercenary history in that book. Because one estimate is that there were thousands of Euro-American mercenaries who went to fight in Southern Africa. And of course, I deal with mercenaries in my Kenya book too, during the so-called Mau Mau Revolt, 52 to 63. And actually, I start that book with a Euro-American mercenary fighting in Kenya, East Africa. And in my book on Southern Africa, it's the longest book I've ever written, it's about almost 900 pages. It's a lot of mercenary history in there because they played a profoundly significant role. And they have no ties to where they're fighting. So I think that makes them even more unprincipled than combatants who may have ties. So, yeah.
And then going back, and mercenaries are, of course, continuing to be used today, particularly by the U.S.
Oh, yeah.
As we know.
Contractors, as they're called.
Right, they change it to contractors and make it sound get more palatable somehow. To continue to go down to your list of books that you wrote during that time period, it looks like the next one, sorry, I'm flipping around, is the Zimbabwe book, From the Barrel of a Gun, the U.S. War against Zimbabwe.
Yes.
Then the W.E.B. Du Bois book we mentioned. Well, there's three of them. So to be clear, it's the one you wrote with your sister Mary, Encyclopedia. The next book is Race War, White Supremacy.
Oh yeah, I should really talk about that because, so I got another Fulbright to go to Hong Kong, which I really enjoyed. It's funny, I go to Zimbabwe in 1995, which is after South African independence in 1994. I arrived in Hong Kong in 1999 after the handover, or the reversion, as the Chinese like to call it, from British rule to Beijing rule. And I include, in my 1776 book, I include this anecdote, which I think is quite illustrative. So when I was in Hong Kong, I used to take taxis all the time because they weren't that expensive. This is before Uber and Lyft. And I would notice that these Chinese taxi drivers, they would oftentimes pass by Chinese people to pick me up. Of course, I'm from New York. And so, I mean, you know the running joke about a Black man in particular. I don't know how it is today. It's almost like a cliche, being passed by taxi drivers. As a matter of fact, it's, if I was with a woman in New York, I would go like hide maybe behind a post, a street lamp, and have her flag the taxi. And then she would hop in and keep the door open, then I would jump in. So I noticed this, and of course, I sort of unpack it in the 1776 book where I say, well, you know, maybe they thought I was a tourist, give them a nice tip, thought I was an African diplomat. But in any case, it was ironic that the place where I was born in North America, they passed me by, and in China, they picked me up. They passed by Chinese people to pick me up. It's part of the contradictions. So I enjoyed, and of course, I did that book, Race War, which has been translated into Japanese, by the way. Here it is right here. Although you know, it's just like having a child. You can't always order the life of a child. They go their own way. So so the book is about how
sorry to interrupt you, just for the sake of the audience, the full title is Race War, White Supremacy, and the Japanese Attack on the British Empire.
Right.
Sorry to interrupt you.
It's on the Pacific War, particularly between the US and Britain on the one hand and Japan on the other. And because, you know, these white supremacists, you know, they had turned off so many people. And so they were basically preparing the path for Japan to take over. As a matter of fact, right, my Southeast Asia book that I'm working on now, one of the threads is going to be about the White Rajas, who were these British guys who in the 1840s, just as Britain was taking over Hong Kong, they take over, I think it's Brunei. I'm almost sure it's Brunei, Brunei, which of course is a very wealthy place now. And they ruled Brunei, the Brooke Fountain, for about 100 years until the Japanese come in and kick them out, basically. And so one of the things I wanted to explore is, and of course I explore that even more in a book that comes out in 2018, 2019, Facing the Rising Sun, about African Americans, particularly in Japan, is, you know, the impact of Tokyo's appeal on Black people in particular. Now, the race war, it deals with the impact on Indians, South Asians, I should say, South Asians in particular. Because as I point out, and as any Indian historian could tell you, although I've found talking to South Asians anecdotally, Pakistani Americans, Indian Americans, they're generally not familiar with the fact that one of the national heroes of India, Subhash Chandra Bose, who would be grouped with Gandhi and Nehru as a national hero, he died fighting shoulder to shoulder with the Japanese against the British imperialists, the British colonialists. So I did research in Hong Kong for that book. I also traveled to Japan to do research in the book. And of course, I was able to get an assistant because I don't read Japanese when I went to Tokyo. Although I have to say I was quite moved. You know, it reminds me when Nelson Mandela came to the United States and Ted Koppel, the ABC interviewer, wanted him to repudiate Fidel, and Yasser Arafat, etc. He wouldn't do it. So, you know, I'm going to repudiate the people that helped me, and not, you're Johnny-come-latelys, the U.S. people, and now I have to take your line. Mm-hmm. And so even though I tried to be clear in both of these Asia books that I was, to put it mildly, unsympathetic to Japanese depredations in Korea and China, which of course is still a live issue, mm-hmm. that to me, the pressure Japan put on the United States is one of the reasons that Jim Crow began to crumble. Mm-hmm. So I have to be able to sort out these contradictions. I mean, these US people, they sort out contradictions all the time. They just don't want other people to do it. I mean, for example, you know, they don't like communists. They don't like the Soviet Union. But then they sided with the Soviet Union between 1941 and 1945, changed Hollywood movies to prepare the US population to go along with it. So they're flexible when it comes to them saving their own skins, but we always have to take their line and then excoriate it if we don't. It's ridiculous. So I enjoyed. What I was going to say is that the Japanese nationalists have adopted that book. I didn't write it for them, but as I said, it's just like raising a kid. You can't. The kid goes their own way. I mean, so it's the same with books. I mean, I can't help it. The Japanese nationalists adopt this book.
And you were in Hong Kong from 99 to 2000?
Yeah, I visited Singapore. I'll never forget, in Singapore, the first time I saw a big outdoor screen, I guess they're all over the place now, where they show videos, was in Singapore. And Singapore, of course, is very important in terms of the struggle against white supremacy. I mean, that's a theme in both of my Asia books. And in fact, there's a movie, Paradise Road. You might want to make a note of that. This is very interesting. With Glenn Close and Kate Winslet. so the movie starts out. So, you know, these British colonizers, they're living large pre-Japanese invasion. They're lording it over the Asians and all that. And so the movie starts out. So they're partying, you know, in Singapore. This is early February 1942, just before the Japanese invasion. So there's a boom, an explosion. People sort of look around, whatever, they go back to partying. Then there's another boom. And then all these Japanese soldiers march in and say, all you people are under arrest. Mm-hmm. And so the movie is about how the plot unfolds. And what's interesting about that movie, too, is that in terms of the sexual economy of conquest, which we all know about in terms of European invasions of North America and depredations visited upon African women, you get a glimpse of that with regard to how the Japanese are treating Australian women, Euro-Australian women, British women, et cetera. It's very interesting. I mean, when the shoe was on the other foot. Mm-hmm. I oftentimes show that to my classes. Anyway.
And did you pick Hong Kong for the research, or was there another reason?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because, you know, I've had this torturous relationship with China over the years. And so I wanted to get to a territory that's ruled by China. Mm-hmm. Because I wanted to ask some people questions. And then it's interesting, when I got to meet some of the comrades in the Chinese Communist Party. But whenever I would try to talk to them about some of their policies in the past, they act like they didn't speak English, they didn't understand what I was saying. You know, I didn't speak Chinese. And so it was, so I wanted to try to understand China better, because I sensed even then, and you know, 1990s, that China was it's moving ahead. So I wanted to get in on the ground floor, or get an early peek at the rise of China. I was in Macau, for example. Macau was former Portuguese territory for hundreds of years. The handover takes place in December 1999. I was in Macau during the handover. Now, Macau now is
like a Las Vegas, right?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Sheldon Adelson, the former Trump funder, Nevada casino magnate, was always curious. He invested a small fortune in Macau. Yeah, so, and of course, there was a relationship between, since it was Portuguese territory, there were Mozambicans being dragged to Macau from the inception, because it's just a straight shot across the Indian Ocean. I mean, you can travel by boat directly from Maputo, Mozambique, straight to Macau. So it was a very enlightening, that's when I started reading the Far Eastern Economic Review, which is no longer with us. I enjoyed reading that publication. Oh yeah, I should also mention that part of my media diet, although it's not as regular as it should be, is reading the Japan Times, which you can read online. As a matter of fact, Japan Times, which is sort of a bourgeois newspaper, they like my Japan book too. But I'm not responsible. I disclaim responsibility.
And then, did you have an opportunity to go to mainland China?
Of course. As a matter of fact, the first time, this may be the busiest intersection on planet Earth to this day, when you cross from Hong Kong into Shenzhen. Now, Shenzhen now is a major economic force. Meng Wanzhou, the chief financial officer of Huawei, the Chinese telecommunications giant, who was detained 1,000 days in Vancouver at the BC at the behest of the United States. When she flies back to China just about 8 days ago, she flies directly into Shenzhen, which I think is Huawei's headquarters. So it's so busy because, first of all, you have to go through passport control to leave Hong Kong. And then you have to go through passport control to enter the mainland, the People's Republic. You talk about crowds. God, it's unbelievable. And I visited Singapore, Tokyo. I did research in Australia. I never forget flying to Australia from Hong Kong. The flight attendants, they come in and like disinfect the whole plane. They're spraying stuff on all the passengers, including me. You know, mostly Chinese, of course. It's a very strange experience.
Just like a xenophobia thing?
I'm sure they had a so-called public health reason. And I should also mention, although, yeah, I went to Australia, did research in, I think, Sydney, Melbourne, and Canberra, the capital. Subsequently, I retraced those steps after I came to Houston. For that book, The White Pacific, which comes out in 2007, because at that point, I also went to New Zealand and to Perth, which is out on the West Coast, Australia, facing Indonesia.
What were your impressions of Australia? Because I often hear that it's extremely racist place.
Well, you know, the analogies I draw is between, say, Berkeley, San Francisco in the 70s versus Los Angeles, where Berkeley, San Francisco is New Zealand, Los Angeles, which then was conservative, was like Australia. Or alternatively, Tucson, Phoenix, with Tucson being more progressive, Phoenix at that time not so progressive, or New Mexico, Arizona, New Mexico being more progressive there. And so, and part of the reason is that the Maoris, the indigenous population of New Zealand, they were good fighters. And so they were able to survive to a degree that the indigenous population of Australia was not. They were very good fighters. And of course, you know, I'm sure you're familiar with the All Blacks, the rugby team, and the haka, when they come out and do their war chant before they destroy teams on the rugby field. They're a good fighter. And so New Zealand, the Maori population is maybe about 15% of the population. It's officially bilingual. And that's opened the door for other non-Europeans to enter New Zealand. Yeah, I appreciated being in New Zealand. Now, Australia, I mean, it's a typical British place in the sense that since I have this US accent, I didn't really have any problem. And I'm sure if I had a Jamaican or Nigerian accent, I'd probably have more difficulty. But as it was, you know, they're trying to stay on the good side of the United States. Of course, they're now, with this latest submarine deal, they're like a neo-colony of the United States.
Yeah, man, it's interesting when you look at the, you know, the three countries that are coming together towards what seems like the end stages of white supremacy.
Well, you know, that's one of the things I've been pointing out. As a matter of fact, I've been using the metaphor circling the wagons, which is what the metaphor from the settlers. You know how you have a single file wagons, and then when the Native Americans attack, they circle the wagons. And that's what I think, because it's interesting, as I pointed out on WPFW, which I do this periodic commentary on in Washington, they excluded New Zealand and Canada. And I suspect it's because both have influential left-wing movements.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just Britain, United States, Australia. That's it. New Zealand, Canada out.
Yep. And then after Hong Kong, where did you went back to North Carolina?
Yeah, I went back to North Carolina. Oh, and then by 2003, I came to Houston. That's when my productivity takes off, because I get this endowed chair, which involves research funds. And so from 2003 to 2020, I was traveling just about every weekend when I wasn't writing. I was usually only in Houston 2 days a week. I teach Monday and Tuesday, take off Tuesday night, stay away till Sunday night, come back, teach Monday, Tuesday, and then repeat the cycle. And so I was traveling, as I said, I went to South Seas, did a book on Hawaii, did 2 books on Hawaii, in fact. London. In 2016, I did work for my Southern Africa book on the Indian Ocean coast of South Africa. I did work in Brazil for the book on the African slave trade to Brazil and Portugal. For the book on Haiti, I did research in both Haiti and France. For the books I did on the Caribbean, I did work in Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, of course, which has very good archives. I tried to do research in Antigua, but didn't work out. Guyana, of course. When I was in Guyana, I recall it was a very chilling experience, because it began to rain heavily. And I thought the city was going to flood. And actually, the water did get pretty high. I did work in Argentina for that Brazilian slavery book. I also worked in Cape Town, because I recall flying from Buenos Aires to Cape Town. A straight shot. I tried to do work in Zanzibar for that slave trade book, but it didn't work out. Sometimes, these research trips don't work out, but it was good being in Zanzibar because it was a former main entrepot for the African slave trade.
Mm-hmm. And when you say it didn't work out, what do you mean by that?
Well, like in Antigua, they wouldn't let me in.
To the archive?
Yeah.
Did they give a reason?
No. I mean, that happens sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And let's see, Zanzibar.
Do you typically call in advance or let them know in advance?
I try to, but then, especially nowadays with websites and emails, I think this was before the proliferation of websites and emails. Yeah, it's quite advisable to let these archivists know that you're about to arrive.
Because I know some of them require appointments and stuff like that.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So I think that covers all of the areas I've visited.
And did you mind traveling so much? Like it seems it would get exhausting.
Nah, not at all. Because you read on the plane. Sometimes you get into a city and you're tired, but you plow through and get up in the morning and go work. And then the archive closes at 5, and then maybe come back and go to bed early. That's all. And then you're refreshed. I remember one time flying to London. Oh yeah, I was doing research for the book Negro Comrades at the Crown, which comes out in 2013, as I recall. And somehow the plane landed in the morning, and I'd had a fitful rest on the plane. So I was very tired. But I went to the archive, went to the National Archives of the UK anyway, plowed through, and then went back to the hotel and went to sleep early. Next day, I was refreshed.
And you usually have contacts that you socialize with in most places, or you just stay
Not
focused on
really.
work?
Not really. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, occasionally. Oh, well, when I was doing my Caribbean books, Richard Hart, who was a historic figure, he's dead now, a historic figure for the Jamaican independence movement. His papers are cited somewhere. Some of them are in Jamaica, some of them are at a university in the UK. But I spent time with Richard Hart because he opened his files to me before they were deposited. And he's a historic figure. I wanted to talk to him about Jamaica, Caribbean independence movement, of which he played a central role. H-A-R-T. He also did history. He wrote a number of interesting books on Jamaican slavery. Sometimes I hire research assistants, but I usually don't socialize with them. It's just a working relationship. Especially if I'm researching where I think my grasp of the language needs bolstering. Like researching in France for the Haitian Revolution book, researching in Portugal for the Brazil book, researching in Spain for the Cuba book. But I don't, it's just a working relationship.
Yeah, I can't even handle the hustle and bustle of going in and out of an airport. So traveling every week would drive me nuts. But I guess you get used to you get used to the routine. It's like taking the subway to work,
Right. Yeah, it's not a big deal.
How did you choose Houston, or the University of Houston? Or
Well, they recruited me, and given the productivity, it's hard to quarrel with that choice of coming here. Although now, since I'm in lockdown, as I said, in lockdown, I'm reading microfilm. That's my new thing, which I got a microfilm machine, and it sort of changed the direction. But eventually, for the Northeast Africa project and the Southeast Asia project, I'm going to have to travel. But I'm assuming, actually, Monica Gandhi, who is a specialist, she's at the Medical Center at University of California, San Francisco. She had a piece in the Wall Street Journal just the other day where she says she predicts that COVID is going to be like the flu. Like, thousands of people die from the flu every year, but it doesn't necessarily lead to a lockdown or. And so she says we can envision COVID evolving in a similar direction. And if so, I'll be back on the road. Hopefully, I'm hoping by February or March. Because speaking of February, I should mention, I go to lots of film festivals. So every year for about a decade or more, I've been going to the Pan-African Film Festival in Los Angeles. I recommend it highly. I used to go to the Toronto Film Festival a lot. Not so much in recent years. But the Pan-African Film Festival I go to all the time. So I'm hoping I can go back in February.
Yeah, I mean, they had it online this past year.
Yeah, it wasn't bad. I saw some good stuff online, but I prefer the camaraderie because they're regulars who come to this film festival every year. Now, I know the people who run it. As a matter of fact, I've spoken there a number of times. As a matter of fact, if you go online, you can find an occasion where I was speaking with Nate Parker, who does the Nat Turner movie, and my college classmate, Preston Holmes, who was producer of that movie. We're all on a panel together
Mhm.
on YouTube. This is the Pan African Film Festival.
And you spoke this last year.
Yeah, probably. Oh, yeah, with Angela. Yeah, I did
Angela
it with
Davis.
Angela. Right. Yeah, I do lots of work with them.
Mhm.
Yeah. So hopefully I'll be back in February.